Rain hammered the concrete of a parking garage beneath a Manhattan high-rise, the night Elias Falcone learned that power means nothing when you're bleeding out alone in the dark. For 12 years, he'd been the most feared man on the East Coast, the head of the Falcone family, a man who'd built an empire from the ashes of his murdered father, who ruled the waterfront with a cold smile and colder eyes. At 37, he had everything money could buy, and nothing a heart could need. Men trembled when he walked into a room. He hadn't trusted a living soul since he was a boy who watched his father die on a kitchen floor. And he'd convinced himself that loving anyone was simply a weakness his enemies could use. But on this night, the empire he'd bled for began to crumble in a single instant. Gunfire echoed off the concrete. His own guards dropped, and Elias shot twice. His expensive suit soaked dark. His phone screen cracked beneath him, crawled into the shadow of that garage, and realized the terrible truth every powerful man eventually faces. When the worst happens, the people you own are nowhere to be found. He dialed. No one answered. The city above him kept laughing, kept drinking, kept living, completely unaware that the king of its underworld was dying in the dark beneath their feet. And that's when she appeared. Not a soldier, not a doctor in a white coat. A woman in a gray janitor's uniform, pushing a cleaning cart, her dark hair pulled back, her hands rough from work the world refused to see. Her name was Lucia Reyes, 27 years old, invisible to everyone who'd ever walked past her, a woman the system had chewed up and thrown away, drowning in debt, scrubbing floors at midnight to keep her sick mother alive. Most people would have screamed. Most people would have run. But Lucia dropped to her knees in that pooling blood, pressed her hands to his wound, and did something that made Elias's fading eyes go wide, because those hands moved like they'd done this 1,000 times before. This terrified, ruthless man, who'd spent his whole life believing the people beneath him were nothing, was about to owe his life to the one person he'd never once have looked twice at. In 15 seconds, with nothing but the tools on a cleaning cart, she'd do what his army of paid men couldn't. She'd keep him breathing. Neither of them knew yet that this single, impossible moment would tangle their fates together, drag them through betrayal and blood and a love neither one was supposed to survive, because the woman kneeling in the dark was hiding a secret of her own. And the man dying in her hands was about to discover that the person who saves you is rarely the one you'd expect, and that sometimes the soul most worth saving is the one everyone, including himself, had already given up on. Before we go any further, if a story about second chances and unlikely heroes is something you believe in, do us a quick favor and tap that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that no one's too far gone to be saved. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to that rain-soaked garage in New York, to the 15 seconds that changed 2 broken lives forever. The rain was still pouring outside when Elias Falcone felt his consciousness slipping out of his grasp like sand running through his fingers. All his life, he had been used to controlling everything. Every transaction, every person, every breath in any room he entered. But now his body no longer obeyed him. His breathing had shortened into rough, rattling gasps. His chest felt as heavy as if someone had laid a slab of concrete on it, and the cold from the parking garage floor seeped into his bones, crawling toward a place inside him he had believed had frozen over long ago. The woman kneeling beside him didn't say much. She pressed harder against the wound in his abdomen, then leaned over to examine the second bullet wound in his shoulder, her eyes sweeping over his body with a kind of focus that struck him as strange. She didn't look at him as if she were looking at a boss. She looked at him as if she were looking at a problem that needed to be solved, and that, in his final moment of clarity, made him trust her. Elias tried to open his mouth, his lips cracked and salty with blood, and what came out was only a hoarse, gravelly whisper. "Don't call the police. Don't call 911. Lucia froze for half a second. She had been about to pull out her phone, her fingers already touching the fabric of her uniform near her pocket. But that sentence stopped her. An ordinary person who had been shot would beg to be taken to the emergency room, would scream for an ambulance, not plead for the opposite. In that instant, she understood that the man dying under her hands was not an ordinary victim, and that if she did the right thing by the book, she might be signing his death sentence, or even her own. She looked around the deserted parking garage, where flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly glow over the spreading pool of blood, and she made a decision she would later question over and over again more times than she could count. She wouldn't call anyone. She would get him out of here herself. Lucia pulled off her thin coat, folded it into a thick pad, and pressed it hard against the wound in his abdomen, then took Elias's ice-cold hand, placed it over the coat, and ordered him in a voice that allowed no argument, "Hold this tight, don't let go." He obeyed, and perhaps that was the first time in 12 years that Elias Falcone had followed someone else's order without resisting. Getting an unconscious man of nearly 220 pounds out of the parking garage was a nightmare. She slipped her shoulder beneath his uninjured arm, braced every ounce of her small body to lift him, and together they staggered step by step toward the exit, leaving behind a long, smeared trail of blood across the concrete floor. Elias faded out and came back again, the world around him reduced to broken fragments, the smell of gasoline, the sound of her shoes slapping through puddles, her ragged breathing beside his ear, and the way she kept calling his name to hold him in the present. "Stay with me. Don't close your eyes. Look at me." The rain met them at the door like a wall of freezing water, striking Elias in the face and pulling him back to consciousness just enough for him to realize he was being pushed into the back seat of an old car, an aging sedan with torn upholstery and the smell of dampness, nothing like the armored vehicles he usually rode in. Lucia slid into the driver's seat, her hands trembling from the cold and from fear. His blood smeared all over her uniform, and she started the car amid the engine's rough coughing. In the rearview mirror, she caught his eyes staring hazily at her, and for the first time since everything had begun, she saw something in the eyes of the most powerful man on the East Coast that she had never expected. Not brutality, not command, but the raw fear of a human being who didn't want to die alone. She pressed the gas, the car rushed into the New York rain, and she had no idea what she was carrying, or what she was driving straight into. The old sedan had been driving for nearly 20 minutes when Elias's phone, the only thing still intact in his coat pocket, gave one weak vibration, and then went dead as its battery ran out. But the final location signal it had sent was enough. Lucia had just pulled into the alley behind her apartment building, and was struggling to figure out how to haul Elias out of the back seat when a sweep of headlights cut across the rain, followed by the screech of tires on wet pavement. A black SUV rolled in and blocked the mouth of the alley. Its doors flew open, and before she could understand what was happening, a heavily built man had rushed toward her, a black gun aimed straight at her forehead, less than a handspan away. His voice was deep and cold, every word like a bullet already chambered. "Step away from him, right now, or I'll blow your skull open." Lucia froze. She stood there in the rain, both hands still stained with Elias's blood, her uniform soaked and clinging to her body, and she realized that no matter what she said, in this man's eyes, she was only the person standing beside his boss, while he lay gasping in a pool of blood, which meant she was the prime suspect. Hank Delgado had followed that signal with the ironclad certainty that he was about to find whoever had attacked Elias, and now the instincts of 20 years in the underworld were roaring inside his head that this woman was the assassin, that she had been sent to finish the unfinished job. His finger tightened around the trigger. Lucia slowly raised both hands, palms facing outward, and she didn't beg. She only spoke in a trembling but clear voice. "I didn't do this. I'm trying to save him. And if you shoot me, no one will be left to stop his bleeding, and he'll die before you can get him anywhere." That sentence made Hank freeze for half a second, but he didn't lower the gun. His eyes flicked quickly toward the back seat, where Elias lay motionless, his skin ashen, and the suspicion inside him still refused to let go. He hissed through his teeth. "You think I'm going to believe some girl in a janitor's uniform? Who sent you? Aldridge." At that exact moment, from the darkness of the back seat, Elias gathered the last scraps of strength left in him. He couldn't form a sentence. His throat released only a broken, hoarse sound, but his trembling hand lifted from his thigh, slowly, painfully, and he pointed toward Lucia, then turned his palm down against his own chest, a gesture Hank had seen his boss make 1,000 times to signal that this person was on their side. Hank went still. He looked at Elias's blood-soaked hand, looked at the weak, pleading eyes of the man he had sworn to protect with his life, then looked back at the small woman standing in the rain with both hands raised. Everything in him was still shouting that this was a trap, that there was no way a nobody could have just happened to appear at the right moment to save the head of the Falcone family, but Elias's gesture was something Hank couldn't ignore. Reluctantly, inch by inch, he lowered the barrel of the gun, though his finger never left the trigger, and his eyes stayed locked on Lucia with a cold vigilance, as if one wrong move from her, even a fraction of an inch, would end everything. He said, his voice carrying less killing intent now, but still full of threat. "You go first. I'll carry him, and if he dies, you die with him." "Understood." Lucia nodded, her throat dry, and when Hank bent down and lifted Elias out of the car with the solid arms of a man used to carrying both corpses and the living, she knew she had just escaped death by the narrowest margin, but she still wasn't safe. She had stepped one foot into a world where kindness was treated with suspicion, human life was cheap, and trust had to be paid for in blood. A world she had no idea she would never again leave unchanged. Elias woke in a world utterly foreign to everything he had ever known. The ceiling above his head was cracked and mottled with yellow stains. A bare light bulb gave off a weak, tired glow, and somewhere in the room came the steady drip of water from a rusted pipe. He was lying on an old sofa, pushed against the wall, his body carefully bandaged, the wound in his abdomen sewn shut with rough stitches that were, to his astonishment, even and firm, and every breath still sent pain needling through him. But he was alive, a fact even he found hard to believe. He tried to push himself up, but a tearing pain ripped through his body and made him grit his teeth, and at once a hand pressed him gently back down. Lucia was sitting on a wooden chair beside him, dark circles under her eyes from staying awake all night, still wearing the clothes stained with dried blood, and she told him he shouldn't move because the stitches could split open. Elias let his eyes move around the cramped apartment, taking in the tiny kitchen with its dented pots, the thick stack of bills half tucked behind a sugar jar, the faded curtain patched with thread of a different color, and an uncomfortable feeling rose inside him, not because of the poverty of the place, but because he, Elias Falcone, the man who owned penthouses overlooking the entire city, was lying here, alive because of the mercy of someone he normally wouldn't have looked at twice. He hated the feeling of owing a debt. In his world, debt was what bound people, the invisible chain the strong used to control the weak, and now he was the one at the other end of that chain, in a position he had never tasted before. His instincts immediately searched for a way to regain the upper hand in the only way he knew. He asked her in a hoarse voice that had already recovered its familiar coldness, "How much do you want?" Lucia lifted her eyes to him, not understanding, and he made it clearer. "Money. To pay for this. For your silence. For your apartment. For everything. Name your price and I'll handle the rest. And you'll never have to see me again." He thought she would seize the opportunity. He had seen too many people's eyes brighten at the mention of money, had bought too much loyalty and too much silence with thick stacks of cash, until he believed every human being had a price. But Lucia only looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head, and she said in a weary but firm voice, "I didn't save you for money. I saved you because you were dying right in front of me, and I couldn't stand there and watch a person die when I could do something." Her answer made Elias frown, because it didn't fit any script he had ever calculated, and his confusion made him turn harsher. He let out a soft laugh full of contempt and said, "Everyone has their price. You just haven't named the number yet. Don't pretend you're noble. People like you don't turn down money." He said it with all the cruelty that had sunk deep into him, the nature of a man accustomed to seeing the world as a chessboard, with only those who used others and those who were used, and he waited for her to change her mind, waited for that familiar greed to appear in her eyes, but it didn't come. Instead, Lucia stood up, walked to the sink, turned on the water to wash the hands that were still marked with his dried blood, and said without even turning around, "You think this whole world is like your world, but it isn't." And then she turned off the kitchen light, leaving him alone in the dark with his pain and a strange, deeply unpleasant feeling. The feeling of a man who had just encountered, for the first time in his life, something money couldn't buy, and he lay there, glaring up at the cracked ceiling, unable to understand this woman at all, and even less able to understand why that unsettled him so much. The next morning, when pale sunlight slipped through the patched curtain, there came a soft knock at the door in a familiar rhythm, and Lucia opened it for a woman around 30 years old, who stepped inside with a bag of medical supplies hidden beneath her coat. It was Patrice Lombardi, the nurse who had once worked with her at the hospital years ago, and the only person left in this world who still called her doctor. Patrice glanced at Elias lying on the sofa with wary eyes, then pulled Lucia into the corner of the kitchen and whispered that her friend was playing with fire, that the man was clearly tied to dangerous things, but she still quietly set the bag of gauze, sutures, and antibiotics on the table, because she knew trying to stop her would be useless. Lucia had never turned her back on someone who needed saving, even when doing so had once cost her everything. After Patrice left, Elias, who was more alert now and had been listening to every word, asked why a nurse would call her doctor, and for the first time since he had awakened, an old pain flickered across Lucia's face. She didn't pour out the story. She only spoke in short pieces, saying that 2 years earlier, she had been a third-year surgical resident at a public hospital in Manhattan, that she had once been good, once been expected to become something, once believed that as long as she did the work the right way, everything would be fine. Then, during one night shift, a young man was brought in with a ruptured spleen, acute blood loss, and blood pressure dropping without restraint, and the required protocol demanded approval from a senior surgeon before the operation could begin. But that surgeon, for reasons tied to insurance and to the fact that the patient didn't have valid papers, ordered them to wait for verification, to wait for procedure, to wait for things the boy on the table no longer had enough time to wait for. Lucia had stood there, watching the vital signs fall in free fall, and she had made a choice. She picked up the scalpel against orders, opened the boy's abdomen, and clamped the blood vessel that was spurting inside him, and the boy lived. It should have been a victory, but a few days later, the boy developed an infectious complication, the kind of thing that could happen after any surgery, and the senior doctor, to protect himself from responsibility for delaying an emergency operation, turned the entire story upside down, making Lucia into a reckless, undisciplined resident who had acted on her own outside her authority and endangered a patient. The state medical board convened, and in a room full of people who had never stood in an operating room at midnight, with a life slipping out of their hands, they stripped her of her medical license, a decision that, by reason, followed procedure, but at its core was a cold injustice so suffocating it was hard to breathe. She told Elias that what hurt her most wasn't losing her career, but the fact that the whole system would rather let a person die according to the rules than save him by violating procedure, and that the boy she saved was still alive, still walking somewhere out there, while she had lost everything. After that came the long slide downward, the medical school loan of more than $200,000 hanging over her head like a sentence, her mother falling ill and needing steady money for medicine every month, and a person who had once held a scalpel, now only able to find work cleaning buildings at night, where no one asked who she used to be, where she became invisible in exactly the way the world wanted her to disappear. Elias lay still and listened, and for the first time, he looked at this woman with different eyes, because he realized the hands that had saved his life in that parking garage were not some random miracle, but the remnants of a talent the decent world outside had trampled on and thrown away. And a strange thought crept into his mind, that perhaps she and he, though they stood at opposite extremes of life, were both products of the same thing, the betrayal of those who should have protected them. As his strength slowly returned, Elias wouldn't allow himself to lie still for even one more hour, because in his world, a wounded man who didn't find out who had struck at him was no different from a man signing his own death warrant for the next time. Hank came by the apartment at dusk, carrying a clean phone and a stack of papers, and the two men sat across from each other at Lucia's rickety kitchen table, retracing every detail of that fateful night like two wolves scenting blood. The problem wasn't who had pulled the trigger, but a truth far more chilling, that the attacker had known exactly where Elias would be, at what time, which way he would take down to the parking garage, and how many bodyguards would be with him when he left the meeting. The schedule that night hadn't been written on paper, hadn't been sent by text, hadn't leaked outside. It had existed only in the minds of a very small number of people, the closest people within the Falcone family, the ones Elias had trusted enough to place his very life in their hands. Hank went through each name one by one, gradually crossing out those who had alibis or had fallen during the ambush, and with every name that was crossed off, the air in the room grew thicker, because both men were moving closer to a conclusion neither of them wanted to say aloud. In the end, only one name remained, standing there alone in the middle of the page: Gideon Pike, the family's longtime advisor, the man who had stood beside Elias's father since the hard early days, the man Elias spoke of with a rare note of respect and regarded almost like a blood uncle. Hank didn't dare believe it. He shook his head and said Gideon had served this family for more than 30 years, that it couldn't be possible. But it was Elias who placed his finger on that name and held it there, because something icy was spreading through him, the numbing, familiar feeling of a man betrayed by the very person he had loved most. He had no proof yet. He told himself he needed proof before acting. But the survival instinct sharpened over 12 years was roaring inside him that this intuition wasn't wrong. And then, just as suspicion was tightening around his chest, Another fear, more private and much deeper, suddenly surged up and made Elias sit upright so fast that his wound stabbed with pain because he had just remembered Noelle. Noelle was his sister, 29 years old, the only blood he had left in this world, the only person who had ever seen the trembling child inside the ruthless man the whole city feared. She had end-stage heart failure, her heart weakening more with each passing day, and she was on the national transplant waiting list, the list into which Elias had poured more money and connections than he could count to make sure his sister was closely monitored at a leading cardiac center. He told Hank to send men to the hospital immediately, to place discreet guards around her room, because he understood that if the person behind all of this was truly someone inside the house, someone who knew every one of his weaknesses, then that person also knew the surest way to break Elias Falcone was not to put a bullet in him, but to touch Noelle's fragile life. Lucia stood silently in the corner of the kitchen listening to everything, and when she heard about the young woman's illness, the doctor's instinct inside her awakened. She asked quietly about Noelle's condition, about her ejection fraction, about how long she had been waiting for a transplant, professional questions that made Elias turn back and look at her in surprise. And in that moment, two worlds that had seemed as if they would never cross suddenly touched through a single shared point, the life of a human being. And Elias realized that the woman he had once tried to buy off with money might be the weapon he had never expected, or the new weakness he couldn't allow anyone to see. The days that followed passed in a strange kind of quiet, as Elias was forced to remain in that shabby apartment a while longer, so he could recover and stay out of sight of the people sweeping through the city in search of his body. And every night, Lucia changed his bandages, checked his stitches, and made him take his antibiotics on time with the patience of someone whose profession had sunk into her blood. Elias wasn't used to being cared for. All his life, he had been the one who gave orders, the one obeyed out of fear, and no one had ever touched him with a tenderness that asked for nothing in return, so each time Lucia's hand lightly brushed his skin while she dressed his wounds, he felt himself go rigid like a wild animal that had never been stroked. Late one night, when the whole building was sunk beneath the steady whisper of rain, and only the desk lamp cast a dull yellow pool of light, Lucia sat stitching the loosened thread on his shoulder again, and to break the heavy silence, she asked him when he had become the man he was now. Elias stayed silent for a very long time, so long that she thought he would never answer, and then he spoke in a low, hoarse voice that sounded strangely unfamiliar, saying that he had been only 13 years old then. He told her, not to ask for pity, but as if he were reading aloud an old sentence passed down against him, that he had watched his father be shot down right on the kitchen floor of their own home, that he had hidden under the table and seen everything through a narrow gap, the blood spreading across the tile, his father's eyes wide open as they searched for him in the final moment, and the killer's footsteps, leaving at an unhurried pace, as if he had just finished some small errand. He said that from that night on, he had learned a lesson he still believed to be true, that loving someone meant handing your enemies a knife to drive into your back, that the only thing that kept a person alive in this world was making everyone fear you more than they needed you, and that he had spent his entire youth turning the terror of a child into the power of a boss, so he would never again have to lie helpless beneath a table. Lucia's hands went still, and she didn't offer him any hollow words of comfort. She only looked at him for a while and said she understood what it felt like to be betrayed by the world, that she had lived it in her own way, but she had chosen a different lesson. She said that it was precisely when people lost everything, that kindness became the only thing proving they were still human, that she might have lost her career, her honor, and almost everything else, but she wouldn't allow anyone to take away her ability to care about another life, because if she lost that too, then she would have nothing left to keep living for. Elias turned to look at her, and in that dim yellow light, for the first time, he truly saw this woman, not as a benefactor to whom he owed a debt, not as a pawn or a weakness, but as a human being who had passed through the same kind of hell he had, and yet had walked out in the opposite direction. There was a very brief moment, while her hand still rested lightly on his shoulder and their eyes met inside that small circle of light, when something nameless stirred between them, a fragile and dangerous closeness that both of them felt but neither dared to name, and then Lucia was the one who looked away first. She turned aside to put away the needle and thread with hands that trembled slightly, while Elias lay back down and stared hard at the ceiling, his heart unsettled by a feeling he had sworn, since the age of 13, that he would never allow himself to feel again. That fragile quiet shattered on a gray afternoon, when Lucia had just come home from work and heard strange sounds rising from the floor below. Heavy, decisive knocks, one apartment after another, along with the low voices of men questioning her neighbors. She pressed herself against the doorway and looked down the stairwell, and her heart clenched. Two unfamiliar men in dark coats were moving from floor to floor, holding out something that looked like a photograph and pressing each person with questions. Had they seen this man? Had they seen anyone suspicious move in nearby? And the way they spoke, the cold, superior air of men used to using fear to pull information out of people, made her understand at once that they were Bruno Aldridge's men, sweeping every corner of the city to find out whether Elias was alive or dead. She rushed into the apartment, closed the door as softly as she could, and quickly told Elias they were coming. They were right downstairs, and he had to disappear from sight. Elias braced a hand down, trying to sit up, because his instinct was to reach for the gun Hank had left behind and handle it in the way of the underworld. But he was still too weak. His wounds hadn't healed, and firing a gun inside this crowded apartment building would be no different from exposing himself, bringing the police, and bringing death down on the woman standing in front of him. Lucia pushed him into the narrow space between the wall and the old wardrobe, covered him with a heap of blankets and clothes, warned him not to make a single sound no matter what happened, then drew in a deep breath to force her hammering heart to calm just as the knock struck her apartment door. 3 dry sounds. Knock, 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 like a hammer pounding against her ribcage. She opened the door only a crack, wearing the face of an exhausted working woman who had just finished her shift, and the 2 men aimed their probing eyes inside. One of them held out the photograph of Elias and asked whether she had seen this man, whether she had rented a room to a stranger or let anyone stay with her. While his gaze slipped over her shoulder, searching every corner of the room, Lucia looked straight at the photograph, at the face of the man holding his breath in the wardrobe gap, only a few steps from where she stood, then shook her head and said in a flat, weary voice that she worked the night shift, that she was gone from evening until morning and was hardly ever home, that she had never seen anyone like that before, and that even if several new people had moved into the building lately, she wouldn't have noticed. One of the men didn't quite believe her. He shifted his foot as if he meant to step inside, his eyes fixed on the messy pile of blankets in the corner. And in that split second, the whole apartment seemed to stop breathing. Lucia could feel each cold bead of sweat sliding down her spine, but she didn't step back. She only sighed with irritation and said that if they wanted to search the place, they could call the police and come back with proper papers, because she had just come home from work. She was dead tired, and she needed to sleep. That ordinary, annoyed tone, that almost infuriating calm of someone with nothing to hide, finally made the man hesitate. He looked at her for one long, endless second, then grunted, signaled to his companion, and turned away toward the next apartment, leaving Lucia leaning against the closed door, her legs nearly giving out beneath her whole body trembling as the fear she had held back finally broke loose. When their footsteps had faded completely, she pulled the blankets aside, and Elias slowly stepped out from the wardrobe gap, his face pale, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen in him before, not coldness, not calculation, but something close to astonishment, because in all his 12 years of power, he had paid countless men generously, had watched countless men swear loyalty in blood, and yet when a gun barrel came near, they had run or sold him out, while this woman, who owed him nothing and had not taken a single dollar from him, had just stood between him and death without blinking. He didn't say thank you. He didn't know how. He only stood there looking at her for a long time, and for the first time in his life, Elias Falcone wondered whether he had been wrong about people all these years. The final proof came at last, cold and impossible to deny, when Hank appeared at midnight with a tablet and the face of a man who had just witnessed the very thing he had never wanted to believe was true. He had traced the hidden financial channels, the front accounts, the secret meetings, and all of it led back to the same place, Gideon Pike. On the screen was the recording of a conversation that one of the few people still loyal to Elias had risked his life to capture, and the voice rising from that small speaker made the entire room freeze. It was Gideon's voice, the warm, deep voice that had once told Elias stories when he was a child, now calmly discussing with Bruno Aldridge's men how the Falcone territory would be divided after. In his exact words, the Elias problem was permanently resolved. Elias sat motionless, listening to every word, and each sentence was like another knife twisting deeper into a place he had believed had gone numb long ago. Gideon didn't hide his motive in that conversation. He spoke with the bitterness that had gathered inside him for years, saying he had served this family for more than 3 decades, that he had stood beside Elias's father and helped build everything from nothing. Yet when the father fell, the empire was handed to a boy, while he, the man who had poured out more sweat and blood than anyone else, was pushed down into the role of an advisor standing in the shadows, forced day after day to bow his head before the son of an old friend, a son he believed was unworthy. That jealousy had smoldered in Gideon for dozens of years, fed by every order he had to obey, every time Elias made a decision against his wishes, until it turned into a cold resolve to take back what he believed had always belonged to him, even if the price was the life of the child he had once held in his arms. But what made Elias shoot to his feet despite his wounds was not that betrayal. It was the next sentence in the recording. Gideon mentioned Noelle. He told Aldridge's man there was no need to rush to act against the girl, because he had something in his hand more effective than any bullet. He had quietly reached into his contacts within the medical system, into people with authority inside the network surrounding the organ transplant waiting list, so that whenever a heart compatible with Noelle appeared, her file somehow got pushed down, delayed, tangled in invisible procedures, leaving the girl waiting and waiting while her chance never came. Gideon called it the chain around Elias's neck. He said that as long as Elias still loved the girl, he still had a way to control him, and if Elias dared to fight back, all Gideon had to do was let go and allow Noelle's failing heart to stop by the natural course of things, in a way no one could ever hold him responsible for. When he heard that, a white-hot fury surged up inside Elias. He clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles cracked, and the boss's instinct inside him wanted nothing more than to immediately track down where Gideon was hiding and tear him apart piece by piece, giving back in the only language their world understood, blood for blood. Hank was ready too. He said that all Elias had to do was nod, and everything would end tonight. But Lucia, who had been silently listening to all of it from the corner of the room, stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm, which was trembling with rage, and she said softly that if he went to kill Gideon now, he would only become the very thing he had spent his whole life running from, and more importantly, he would never be able to remove the chain from Noelle's neck, because only Gideon knew who he had planted and where he had planted them. Killing him meant burying his sister's last chance with him. Elias stood in the middle of his own storm, with the hunger for revenge that had fed him all his life on one side, and on the other, a different path he had never dared to imagine, and for the first time he realized that the easiest way, the way of the underworld, might be the very way that would kill the only person he still loved. While Hank continued digging deeper into Bruno Aldridge's network to identify the contacts Gideon had planted, a name appeared by chance on the screen and made Elias go still. He enlarged it. A name tied to the Aldridge family, Bruno's only son, a young man who had nearly died in a knife fight 2 years earlier. Something in that line of information sent a ripple through Elias's mind, and he turned to look at Lucia, who had just brought over 2 cups of coffee, then asked her in an unusually cautious voice what the name of the public hospital where she used to work had been, and whether the unauthorized surgery from years ago, the young man she had risked everything to save, had involved a ruptured spleen caused by a stab wound. Lucia set the coffee cups down, startled by the question, and nodded in confirmation. A young man, a knife wound, acute blood loss, and that night she had picked up a scalpel while her superior had ordered her to wait. Elias fell silent, and inside that silence, a massive piece of the puzzle slowly locked into place in a way that chilled the spine. Because the young man Lucia had saved, the life she had traded her entire career to pull back from death's hands, was none other than Bruno Aldridge's son, the son of the sworn enemy now hunting Elias across the city. He turned the screen toward her, and when Lucia looked at the young man's face in the photograph, the blood seemed to drain from her own face, because she recognized it at once, the face she had bent over in the operating room at midnight, the face that had haunted her for 2 years as a symbol of the price she had paid for her kindness. A new tension settled over the room, because now everything suddenly carried a different meaning. Elias spoke slowly, almost as if speaking to himself, saying that perhaps losing her license hadn't been entirely an accident of the system, the way she had always believed. Bruno Aldridge was a man who never tolerated owing anyone a debt, not even owing one to a benefactor, and the fact that an unknown doctor had saved his son's life by breaking the rules was a kind of obligation a man like Bruno wouldn't want to exist, a bond he would want cleanly severed. It was entirely possible that Aldridge's money and hidden connections had quietly reached into the medical board, had magnified Lucia's mistake, had made certain that the woman who had once touched his family's life would be buried at the bottom and never rise again, so no one could ever say the Aldridge bloodline owed a life to anyone. Lucia sank down into the chair, covering her face with both hands, and whispered that for 2 years she had tortured herself, had believed she had been naive, that she deserved to be punished because she hadn't followed procedure, that it had all been her own fault, and now it turned out she had only been a pawn crushed inside a game she hadn't even known she was part of. Her shock quickly shifted into something bitter and trembling, and she lifted her eyes to Elias, realizing a truth even harder to swallow, that her fate and this man's had been tied together long before that night in the parking garage, that the same man, Bruno Aldridge, had destroyed her life and was now trying to kill him, that the 2 wounds they had believed had nothing to do with each other had in truth grown from the same poisonous root. Between them rose a strange tension, both the pain of 2 victims sharing one enemy and a fated connection that made them both shiver, and Elias looked at her for a long time before saying softly that perhaps the night she bent down to save him in a pool of blood hadn't been random at all, but a thread that had been stretched between them long ago, waiting only for the moment it would pull tight around them both. That fated connection, instead of pulling the 2 of them closer, frightened Elias in a way even he had not expected, because he realized he had begun to care about this woman more than safety allowed, and in his world, caring about someone meant placing a target on their back. The next morning, he became distant and cold, with a suddenness that cut through the room, and he told Lucia, in the icy voice of a boss she had thought she would never hear again, that as soon as he was strong enough, he would leave, and she should forget that any of this had ever happened, that she had finished repaying the debt of saving his life, and from now on, they would go their separate ways. She shouldn't be foolish enough to think there was anything between them, because everyone who stood beside him ended up with the same fate, lying inside a coffin. He said those words to push her away, to protect her from the very world that was clinging to him, but he said them so cruelly that she couldn't know it was protection, and all she felt was the brutality of it. Lucia stood still, and instead of crying or begging, she looked at him with eyes that were both wounded and painfully perceptive, then said softly that he was very good at it, very good at pushing away anyone who dared to come close, but she hadn't come close to him because he was Elias Falcone. She had stayed because she didn't know how to abandon a human being. And then she told him something she had never told anyone. She said she once had a younger brother, 6 years younger than her, and when she was 17, he had a severe stomach pain in the middle of the night, a burst appendix that would have been a small matter if he had been operated on in time. But her family had been desperately poor then, with no insurance, and when she and her mother carried the boy into the emergency room, people looked at them with judgment in their eyes, asked about their ability to pay, before they even asked about his symptoms, and left him lying on a stretcher, groaning for hours while papers were passed back and forth, until it was too late. She said she had sat there holding her little brother's hand as it grew colder, listening to him whisper and ask why no one would help him, a question she had never been able to answer after all those years. From that night on, she had sworn she would become the kind of person who would never ask a patient how much money they had before asking where they hurt. She would become the doctor her brother had not had, and that was exactly why she had picked up the scalpel, against orders to save Bruno Aldridge's son. And it was also exactly why she had knelt down in that parking garage to save a blood-soaked stranger, without needing to know whether he was an angel or a devil. She told Elias that she hadn't saved him because he deserved to be saved. She had saved him because she refused to let herself become one of the people who had stood by and watched her brother die. When she finished speaking, the room sank into silence, and Elias, the man who had watched his father be shot down without shedding a single tear, the man who had ordered deaths without blinking, the man who had built an entire empire on the foundation of numbness, suddenly felt something hot rising at the corners of his eyes. He turned his face away, but it was already too late. A tear had rolled down his hard cheek, the first tear in nearly 30 years, and he realized that this woman had not saved him with the hands of a doctor, but with something he had lost so long ago he had believed it no longer existed. A heart that had remained whole even after passing through every kind of hell, and that, not the stitches or the pills, was what was slowly pulling him back into being human. That tear had broken something open inside Elias, but it didn't instantly turn him into another man, because 30 years of instinct could not vanish in a single night, and for many days after that, he was torn between the two clear paths opening before him. The first path was the one he knew by heart, the path of blood. He would gather the people still loyal to him, track down Gideon and Bruno's lairs, then drown everything in a bloody purge, taking back his empire in the very same way he had built it. And one part of him craved that so fiercely, he could almost hunger for the smell of gunpowder, because revenge was the only language his trampled heart understood. But that path carried a price he could no longer ignore. It would bring death with it, perhaps Noelle's, when the cord Gideon had wrapped around her was tightened in retaliation. Perhaps Lucia's, when she was pulled into the spiral of violence, and more importantly, it would lock him forever inside the very prison he had built for himself since he was 13 years old. An endless cycle of hatred and blood that he was beginning to realize had exhausted him down to the marrow of his bones. One night, as he sat by the window looking down at the city with a gun resting on his lap and emptiness in his eyes, Lucia came and sat beside him, and she didn't tell him what he should do. She only asked him a single question, a simple question that drove straight into the deepest part of him, whether he wanted to win or whether he wanted to be free. That question hung in the air for a long time, because Elias had never dared to separate those two things. All his life, he had mistaken victory for survival, had believed that as long as he stood at the top, he would be safe, but now he understood that he had stood at the top for 12 years and had not been free for a single second. He had always still been the trembling child under the table. The only difference was that now the child was holding a gun. He realized that if he killed Gideon and Bruno, there would always be another Gideon, another Bruno, another bullet waiting for him in some parking garage somewhere, and he would die exactly as he had lived, alone in the dark, and for the first time in his life, he dared to think about a possibility he once would have considered a betrayal of everything he represented, stepping out of the underworld completely, not by becoming the strongest man in it, but by destroying the chessboard from the inside. He knew there was such a path, even though every cell in his body recoiled from it, and that path was a female FBI agent named Diane Keller, the woman who had pursued the Falcone family for years, the woman who had tried many times to bring him down, and had once offered him a deal he had laughed in her face for proposing. Now, inside this shabby apartment, Elias quietly picked up the clean phone and dialed a series of numbers he had memorized long ago, the way one memorizes the name of an enemy. When the person on the other end answered in a guarded voice, he said he had enough evidence to bring down not only Gideon Pike, but also Bruno Aldridge's entire network, enough to dismantle the operations the FBI had been hunting for a decade. But he wanted a conditional plea deal. He wanted safety for his sister and for an innocent woman, and he wanted a chance, however fragile, to live the rest of his life as a human being rather than a boss. The other end of the line stayed silent for a long while. Then the female agent answered with caution, laced with doubt, and when Elias put the phone down, he knew he had just crossed a line from which there was no turning back, had just betrayed with his own hand the entire world that had made him. And strangely, for the first time in so many years, his chest felt weightless, as if he had just set down a burden he had been carrying since he was a child. But Gideon Pike wasn't the kind of man who would sit quietly and wait for time to favor him. After many days without finding Elias's body anywhere, without a single piece of news confirming his death, that silence began to gnaw at his patience, and the instinct of a man who'd spent his entire life inside schemes whispered something that chilled him. That perhaps the wolf he thought he'd brought down was still alive, hiding somewhere, licking his wounds and sharpening his fangs. A man like Gideon understood that if Elias was still alive, then he had only one choice. He had to force him to step into the light on his own, and he knew exactly which string to pull. That night, a group of Gideon's men broke into the cardiac center where Noelle was being treated, disabled the guards Elias had placed around her room, and took the girl out of her hospital room along with the monitoring equipment and the bags of medication sustaining her fragile life. The next morning, Elias's clean phone vibrated, and when he picked up, the voice he'd once respected more than any other in his life came through, calm and merciless. Gideon said he knew Elias was still alive, that the game of hiding was over, and that Noelle was now with him. He let Elias hear a few seconds of the girl's broken breathing over the phone, the sound of her weakly calling his name in fear, and then he cut her off, setting his terms in the voice of a man who was certain he'd already won. Elias had exactly 24 hours to appear by himself at a location Gideon would name, alone, unarmed, with no police, in exchange for his sister's life. Gideon added that Noelle's heart didn't have much time left to begin with, and every hour that passed without proper medicine and machines, every hour she was held in fear and distress, was another hour pushing her closer to the edge. So if Elias hesitated, Gideon wouldn't need to do anything at all. He only had to wait, and nature would act in his place. That sentence turned time into the cruelest enemy, because now there wasn't only a murderer holding a knife to Noelle's throat. Her own failing heart was also racing against every passing minute. When the call ended, Elias stood frozen, the hand gripping the phone gone white, and his whole being seemed torn in two. Every careful calculation he'd just built with the FBI, every slow and controlled plan to return to a lawful life, was now being crushed beneath a countdown clock, because if he waited for the FBI to act according to their procedures, it would be too late, and if he rushed in alone to hand himself over as Gideon demanded, then both he and Noelle would die. Lucia saw the rare panic in his eyes, the look of a man standing before the danger of losing the last thing still anchoring him to life, and she gripped both his shoulders, forcing him to look into her eyes, telling him he wasn't allowed to collapse now, that if he ran off in desperation, he'd be playing the exact game Gideon had laid out for him. Hank was there too, his face hardened, and the three of them sat down around the old kitchen table, with a brutal truth placed between them. They had only 24 hours left, a dying sister in the hands of the enemy, an FBI net that hadn't had time to fully close, and a traitor who knew Elias's every move better than anyone else in the world. If they wanted to save Noelle without turning everything into a massacre, they'd have to do something almost impossible: stay exactly one step ahead of Gideon, while the clock on the wall kept coldly marking each second. The breakthrough came from the place no one expected, at a moment when nearly every hope had run dry. Among the men who had followed Gideon after the coup was a man named Marco Belandi, a quiet middle-aged man who had served under Elias's father since his youth, a man everyone believed had fully shifted to the traitor's side in order to save his own life. But Marco had never truly belonged to Gideon. He had pretended to submit, had swallowed his humiliation, and bowed his head through all those days, only to wait for an opening, because in his heart he still carried gratitude toward the father who had taken him in years ago, and he couldn't bear to see the daughter of his benefactor, little Noelle, whom he had once held in his arms, turned into a hostage in the hands of a shameless man. That night, Marco secretly contacted Hank through an old channel known only to those who had been loyal to the family from the beginning, and he passed along the most valuable thing they could have at that moment: the exact location where Gideon was holding Noelle, an abandoned warehouse deep in the old Port District of Brooklyn, along with the layout of the guards and their shift change schedule. Marco warned that this was all he could do, that if he were exposed, he would die too, and that Elias had only a very narrow window in which to act before Gideon had time to grow suspicious. With the information in hand, Elias immediately began drawing up a plan, and this was when the greatest conflict between him and Lucia erupted. She insisted on going with them, and when he flatly rejected it in a firm voice, saying this was a matter of the underworld, that she wasn't allowed to walk into death, she faced him and spoke a truth that neither he nor Hank could deny. She said Noelle's heart was in its final stage, that a shock, a panic attack, even the smallest strain could push her into cardiac arrest at any moment, and if they managed to rescue Noelle without someone there who knew how to handle a medical crisis on the spot, they might save her from Gideon's hands only to watch her die on the way out. She said plainly that his gunmen could shoot through a door, but not one of them knew how to keep a failing heart beating, while she did. Elias stood there, and in that moment he faced the deepest fear inside himself, because bringing Lucia into that warehouse meant placing the woman he had already fallen in love with directly into the line of fire, meant handing fate the very knife he had spent his whole life swearing he would never give it. But he also understood that she was right, and deeper than that, he realized that keeping the people he loved trapped inside a glass cage in order to protect them was also the very way he had imprisoned himself all these years, and that trusting another person, truly trusting them, meant accepting that they could stand beside him in danger as well as in safety. For the first time in his life, Elias Falcone looked into someone's eyes and said he trusted her, that he would let her come with him, not because he had run out of choices, but because he trusted her hands and her heart more than any army he had ever had. He tightened his hand around hers for a brief moment, a gesture standing in for all the words he didn't know how to say. Then turned to Hank and Marco to begin building the most reckless plan of his life, a plan in which they would have to use the very hostage exchange Gideon had arranged to turn the trap back against him, while the price of a single mistake would be 3 lives, and the clock had only hours left as it kept moving, second by second, toward the final line. The abandoned warehouse lay submerged in darkness and the salty smell of the old port district, and exactly at the appointed time, Elias walked in alone through the rusted iron door, both hands raised to show that he carried no weapon, though beneath his shirt, a tiny recording device Diane Keller had given him was quietly capturing every sound, and outside, hidden among the dark containers, the FBI tactical team, along with Hank and Marco, held their breath and waited for the signal. Gideon stood in the middle of the warehouse beneath a sickly yellow light, and beside him, Noelle sat slumped in a chair, her face deathly white, her lips bluish, her breathing shallow and rapid, and just seeing his sister like that forced Elias to summon every ounce of strength he had not to rush toward her. Gideon smiled, the smile of a man certain he had won, and he began to speak, began to boast, because for a proud man like him, victory wouldn't be complete unless Elias heard the whole truth before he died. He admitted that he was the one who had arranged the ambush in the parking garage, that he was the one who had joined hands with Bruno Aldridge to tear apart the Falcone territory, and when the side door opened, Bruno himself stepped inside with several gunmen, the rival boss laughing as he added his own words, confirming every detail of the plot, the two triumphant enemies taking turns exposing their crimes, without knowing that every word was being recorded as evidence against them. But Gideon had lived too long in that world to grow careless. His eyes suddenly stopped at Elias's collar, where a thin wire had shown itself, and his face changed. He roared that there was a recorder, that this was a trap, and in the blink of an eye, everything exploded. The first gunshot tore through the darkness. Gideon and Bruno's men spat bullets toward Elias, and he rolled down behind a pile of wooden crates, while from outside, Hank and the FBI team stormed in, turning the warehouse into a maze of muzzle flashes and screaming rounds. In the middle of the chaos, one of Gideon's men managed to drag Lucia, who had slipped in through the back entrance according to the plan so she could reach Noelle, out as a shield, holding her tightly along with the fading girl. And Gideon, cornered by the desperation of a man about to lose everything, aimed his gun at the 2 women and shouted that if he had to fall, then Elias would lose everything he loved first. In that moment, time seemed to stop, and Elias stood before the final choice of his life. He could go after Gideon and finish the traitor, reclaiming his honor, or he could throw everything away to save 2 lives, and without a single second of hesitation, the man who had once placed power above all things chose to run straight into the gunfire toward Lucia and Noelle. One bullet struck his shoulder, then another tore through his side, but he kept moving, using his own body to shield the 2 women, pulling them down behind a concrete wall just as Hank took down the man holding Lucia captive. And then the thing Lucia had feared most happened. Amid the gunfire and the smoke, Noelle's exhausted heart couldn't withstand the shock. She convulsed, then went limp, stopped breathing, and her pulse disappeared. While Elias's own blood was spreading beneath him, Lucia had to do 2 things at once with trembling hands. She pressed hard against Elias's bleeding wound, then grabbed his hand and made him hold it there himself, just as she had done on that first night in the parking garage, before turning to Noelle, placing both hands on the young woman's thin chest, and beginning chest compressions, counting each beat through the roar of the gunfight, pouring every trace of life she had into her palms, while her mouth begged the girl not to give up. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds passed, each one stretching like eternity. Then 15 seconds. And those exact 15 fateful seconds once again became the line between life and death, until Noelle suddenly coughed, her chest rose, and her heart began beating again beneath Lucia's hands. Around them, the gunfire thinned, then stopped altogether. The FBI team had secured the scene. Bruno Aldridge had been thrown down and handcuffed, while Gideon had collapsed beside the door he had tried to escape through. And amid all that ruin, Elias lay there with 2 bullet wounds in his body, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the woman kneeling between the 2 lives she had just wrested back from death. And for the first time in his life, the man who had once believed that love was weakness understood that it was the only real strength that had saved them all. Gunsmoke still lingered in the air when the FBI medical team rushed in. One crew working to bandage Elias, and another lifting Noelle onto a stretcher with an oxygen tank and a heart monitor. while Lucia still didn't take her hand off the young woman until she was certain her heartbeat had steadied again. Bruno Aldridge was escorted outside amid curses. The boss who had once spread fear across the entire East Coast, now reduced to an old man in handcuffs, his kingdom collapsing in a single night because of the very words he had spoken in triumph. Gideon was different. He had been shot in the leg while trying to escape, and had fallen beside the iron door. And when the agents pulled him up to cuff him, Elias, though he was being supported with 2 wounds in his body, asked them to stop for a moment. He stepped forward and stood before the man who had once been his advisor, once been his uncle in all but blood, once been the familiar shadow that had followed him through his childhood, and he didn't ask why Gideon had betrayed him, because he already understood that. He only looked into his eyes, searching for some remnant of the man he had once respected. But Gideon, bitter with the fury of a man who had lost everything, let out a dry laugh and decided to strike Elias with one final blow, the cruelest blow of all, the truth. He said Elias had spent his whole life hating the men who had shot his father all those years ago, had built an entire empire on the foundation of his vow to avenge that night on the kitchen floor, but he had never suspected that the one who opened the door for the gunman to enter the house that night, the one who told them where his father would be and when he would be vulnerable, was none other than him, Gideon Pike. He said Elias's father had been planning to push him aside, had refused to give him what he believed he deserved. So Gideon had acted, then stood beside the orphaned son he himself had created, playing the loyal uncle for all those years, raising him, teaching him, and silently waiting for the day he could take everything. That confession struck Elias harder than the 2 bullets in his body. The entire worldview he had built from the age of 13, the whole ruthless man he had forged himself into in order to avenge his father, had all grown out of a lie, and the person to whom he had given his deepest trust was the very person who had caused the tragedy that started it all. For a moment, the familiar rage surged through him. His hand tightened, and the old life inside him screamed for him to snatch up a gun and finish Gideon right there. But he didn't. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at Gideon for a long time, and then he realized something that stunned even him. If he killed Gideon now, he would hand him his final victory. He would prove that all his life, he had still been nothing more than something shaped by Gideon's hands, a revenge machine fueled by hatred, programmed by the very man who had destroyed him. Instead, Elias took one step back, and he said in a voice so calm, it was almost chilling that Gideon wouldn't die by his hand. He would live a very long time inside a narrow cell, long enough to see the thing he feared most, Elias Falcone walking out of the world that had created them both, and living a life Gideon could never touch. He turned his back, leaving Gideon to be dragged toward the prison van with his face twisted by the truth that his deadliest blow had failed to break the man he wanted to ruin. And when Elias stepped out of the warehouse into the salty night air, for the first time, he felt the invisible chain that had bound him since he was 13 years old finally snap, not through blood, but through the choice to let go. The months after the night at the warehouse became a slow and painful shedding of skin for Elias Falcone. The recording, along with the trove of evidence he handed over to the FBI, was strong enough to bring down not only what remained of the Aldridge family, but also an entire criminal network the agency had been hunting for a full decade, and in return, he accepted a bitter plea deal, confessed everything, abandoned all illegal operations, dismantled the underworld empire he had built with blood, and stood as a witness in court despite all the hateful eyes fixed on him. He didn't escape the price that had to be paid. There were still legal restraints, conditions of supervision, and a past that couldn't be erased. But he honestly accepted all of it as part of the road toward atonement, and the small amount of legitimate wealth he had left became the foundation for him to begin again, this time not with fear, but with something he had never tried to use before: kindness. When Gideon was arrested, and the entire network he had planted was exposed, the invisible hands that had quietly pushed Noelle's file down to the bottom of the list were dragged into the light and dealt with, and for the first time after months of hopeless waiting, her name was restored to its rightful place in the national transplant system. By then, her condition had worsened so severely that she was placed in the highest priority group, and only a few weeks later, a compatible heart appeared, a gift of life born from the tragedy of a stranger's family, and the transplant surgery went on for many tense hours under the hands of a leading surgical team. Elias sat all night in the waiting room, this time not as a boss who could buy everything, but only as a helpless older brother praying. And when the doctor stepped out to tell him the operation had succeeded, that the new heart was beating steadily inside Noel's chest. He collapsed into the chair and cried for the second time in his life. But this time, they were tears of relief. At the same time, Elias used what remained of his old power in the only proper way he still could. He hired the best lawyers to reopen the case that had buried Lucia's career. And with the lead about Bruno Aldridge's interference in the medical board years earlier, the truth gradually came into the light. The senior doctor who had once blamed her was investigated, and the unjust decision that had stripped away her license was reviewed and finally overturned. On the day Lucia received her medical license back, Patrice Lombardi threw her arms around her and burst into tears. The nurse who had believed in her through 2 long years, when the whole world had turned its back, now able to witness her friend's honor being returned, and she said she had always known this day would come, that someone like Lucia couldn't be buried forever. But what brought Lucia to tears most was not the license. One afternoon, Elias took her to an old building in the working-class neighborhood where she had grown up, a place he had quietly purchased and renovated into a community clinic, a place that would provide free medical care for poor people without insurance, the very people the system had once turned away. And when Lucia looked up at the sign hanging above the door, she froze, both trembling hands rising to cover her mouth, because on it was the name of her younger brother, the boy who had died on a stretcher years ago because no one would save him. The name now solemnly carved onto a place that would make sure no child would ever again have to ask why no one would help. Elias stood quietly behind her and said softly that he couldn't give back the years she had lost, and he couldn't atone for all the sins of his life, but he could begin by turning her deepest pain into a place that could save others, and that was the only way he knew how to say thank you, because she hadn't only saved his life, she had saved his soul. 1 year later, morning sunlight poured through the clean windows of the community clinic named after Lucia's late younger brother, a place now always crowded with people the system had once forgotten, and at the center of it all was Lucia Reyes in a white coat, no longer the invisible janitor mopping floors at midnight, but returned to the person she had always been, a devoted doctor who placed her hands on every patient with the same kindness, whether they were rich or poor. She ran the clinic with Patrice by her side, and every life saved there was a reminder that the kindness that had once cost her everything had, in the end, won. Noelle, with a strong new heart beating inside her chest, often stopped by to help, her smile radiant like someone who had been given an entire second life. And Elias, the man who had once ruled a whole kingdom of darkness, now came to the clinic every afternoon, not with bodyguards and armored cars, but simply as an ordinary man who, for the first time in his life, could live without looking over his shoulder. One afternoon, when the clinic had grown quiet, he stood before Lucia, and the man who had always known how to control every situation suddenly became strangely awkward. He said that all his life he had believed love was a fatal weakness, a knife placed in the hand of an enemy, but she had taught him that it was the only strength great enough to save a person from the hell where he had imprisoned himself for several decades. He said he no longer had an empire, no longer had power, no longer had anything to promise except a healed man and a heart that had finally learned how to love. And then he asked whether she would accept walking with him through the rest of his life. Lucia looked at him for a long time, her eyes shimmering. Then she smiled and answered with the words that left him speechless, saying that she had chosen him from that night, from the night she knelt beside him in a pool of blood without needing to know who he was. It had just taken him a long time to realize it. And in that room filled with sunlight, 2 people who had once stood at opposite ends of life, one who had everything but was empty, and one who had lost everything but still carried an unbroken heart, finally found in each other the thing both had spent their whole lives searching for, a home. The story of Elias and Lucia ends there, but what it leaves behind does not, because deep within it is a truth we sometimes forget amid the busyness of life, that a person's worth does not lie in the clothes they wear, the title they hold, or the wealth they possess, but in the heart they carry, that the person we pass by every day without a second glance may be the very one who saves our life, and that no one, no matter how far they have strayed, is beyond redemption if someone is patient enough to see the real human being inside them. Kindness is never weakness. Respect for the smallest and most overlooked people is never meaningless, and sometimes a single moment of compassion is enough to change 2 destinies forever. If this story has touched your heart, please press the subscribe button for our channel. Like and share this video so you can listen each day to more meaningful and captivating stories. How do you feel about this story? And what does it make you think about your own life? About the quiet people we still meet every day? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your real stories and thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. May you and the people you love always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.